All right, so you ready to get started? Okay. So one more time, I'm Oriana Riley, the Housing and Community Preservation Coordinator with the City of Chelsea. Bathrooms are down this hallway and to the right, or down the stairs, down there. Childcare is right behind these divider tables over here. Pizza is coming in 10-15 minutes. And we have the headset set up. So I want to just give the Director of Housing and Community Development a moment to say a welcome.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Alex. I'm the Director of Housing and Community Development with the City of Chelsea. I just want to thank you all for attending tonight, as well as acknowledge our partners in tonight's meeting, the Anti-Displacement Roundtable, Chelsea City Council, Collaborativa, Green Roots, and a number of partners that made tonight possible and have collaborated with us on this important educational campaign. So the purpose of tonight is to dive into the intricacies of zoning. Zoning is usually this very boring, mundane legalese that really shapes the world around us. It dictates how neighborhoods look. It determines whether or not folks can afford to live in your neighborhood. And it's responsible for causing a lot of the displacement that we're seeing across the city, where rents are going up, landlords are continuously demanding more and more rent, and as a result, families are being pushed out of the city. So a lot of the tools that we have are really through zoning, and at the local level, our goal is to undertake this series of workshops to both have a conversation with the community about zoning, about how you envision your neighborhood looking, and what your ultimate goals are for the city, as well as for the community at large. So we'll start off tonight with a brief history on zoning, including some of its legacies of racism and discrimination. And then we'll segue into a presentation on a description of zoning in Chelsea, and then talk a little bit more about the campaign going forward over the course of the spring. So with that, I do want to turn it over to the city manager to share a couple of remarks before we get started.
Well, thank you, Alex. I really will be brief because there's a lot of content to get through, but I just want to thank you all for coming out. It's very important for us to hear from the community as we think about making some changes to our zoning. There are some efforts we have in mind, but we certainly don't want to do anything that's contrary to the best interests of the residents. So the purpose of these series of meetings is really to get your input, and that will inform what we decide to do when we present subsequent zoning changes to the city council. So again, I really thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to come in tonight. And Oriana.
All right. Right before we get started, I just wanted to go over some community agreements because we're going to have a lot of discussion today at your small tables. So if you're a person who speaks a lot, try to make space for other people to speak. So move up and move back. We're just brainstorming and giving our opinions right now. So try not to say, oh, that's a terrible idea to other people. Try to respect the time constraints. We are on a tight schedule, so be concise with what you want to say. Think about it before you say it. Hopefully one person speaking at a time. And so here at the city and our department, our goal is to create and support equitable, fair, and affordable housing. So that's why we're all here tonight. Does everyone sound like you're in the right place? And these are good community agreements for discussion? All right. Next slide. All right, so I'm going to pass it off to Dana Lewinter, our consultant from the Citizens Housing and Planning Association, to do some introductions with your tables.
Thank you, Oriana. So, hello, I'm Dana. Thanks for having us here in Chelsea tonight. I'm also joined by my colleague Lily, who you'll see kind of wondering about and taking notes. So we're going to start off with you all doing some work at your tables. I know people are sitting kind of around the room. If you are at a space where you don't have materials, raise your hand. We'll make sure to get some to you, or you can move up to some of these spaces up here. But on your tables, you have a bunch of maps. One of them is a redlining map that shows kind of how government programs allowed investment in communities, and then a lot of other data on those maps. So we want you just to take 8 to 10 minutes at your tables, share who you are, and then start looking at those maps. What do you notice? What patterns do you see? What questions do you have? And then we'll come back. On your tables, please make a note. There's a lot of paper, there's sticky notes, there's big pieces of paper, there's pens. Please make sure you're taking notes so that all of the thoughts that you're having at those spaces, we will be collecting and using as we go forward throughout this process. Any questions? All right, so we'll go to that, and then we'll come back up here for some more presentation. All right, thank you everyone. I heard a lot of good conversations going on, and I promise we will be coming back to them as we go forward in this session tonight, and we will have plenty of time to continue the conversations at the future sessions because this is the first of 4. But we want to start with a conversation here tonight about why zoning matters. Why, as Alex was saying, it's a tool that the city can and should use for the benefit of the residents who live here. But why does it matter in the first place? So we're going to do a little bit of a background here before we get going. So, what is zoning? You may see pictures like this, you may see graphs and charts, but essentially zoning is a law that local governments adopt, and it separates land into different sections or zones. And there's different rules that govern those zones depending on how they're qualified. And generally there's 3 main areas that zoning will try to address. So the first is the use or the function. So you could think of this like residential, where people live, commercial, industrial. They also address the shape of buildings. So are they 3 stories or 5 stories? What's the bulk of it on a site as well? And so there's a lot of language that you're going to be hearing as we move forward, but that's really what's essential and important here to catch. So we want to watch a video, so just bear with us while we get that going. And there should be Spanish translation at the bottom here.
In America, you can see how things ended up this way. Once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it. Okay, let's look at MLK Boulevard in Baltimore. I want to show you how to see housing segregation in schools, in health, in family wealth, in policing. But first, an explanatory comment. It's the 1930s in the wake of the Great Depression. FDR is president. He wants to bring economic relief to millions of Americans through a collection of federal programs and projects called the New Deal. One part of that New Deal was the National Housing Act of 1930, which introduced ideas like the 30-year mortgage and low fixed interest rates. So now you have all these lower income people who can afford homes. But how do you make sure they don't default on their new mortgages? Enter the Homeowners Loan Corporation. The HOLC created residential security maps. And these maps, they're where the term redlining comes from. Green meant best area, best people, aka businessmen. Blue meant good people, like white-collar families. Yellow meant a declining area with working-class families. And red meant detrimental encompasses, hazardous, like foreign-born people, low-class whites, and most significantly, Negroes. Again and again on these HOLC maps, one of the most consistent criteria for redline neighborhoods is the presence of black and brown people. Let's be clear, studies show that people who lived in redlined areas were not necessarily more likely to default on their mortgages, but redlining made it difficult, if not impossible, to buy or refinance. So landlords abandon their properties, city services become unreliable, in most places crime increases, and property values drop. All of these conditions fester for 30 years as white people flee to the brand new suburbs popping up all over the country. Many of those suburbs institute rules called covenants that explicitly forbid selling homes to black people, and all of this was perfectly legal. Now it's 1968, and MLK is assassinated.
Good evening. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, 39
Apostle of nonviolence in the civil rights movement, has been shot to
Martin Luther
death.
King was shot and was killed tonight.
In the aftermath, Congress passes the Fair Housing Act of 1968. It's a policy meant to encourage equal housing opportunities regardless of race or religion or national origin, and it offers protections for future homeowners and renters. But it does little to fix the damage already done. Over the next 50 years, the Fair Housing Act is rarely enforced. So you can still see housing segregation and its effects in Baltimore and often along any MLK Boulevard in any U.S. city, like its effects on wealth. So home ownership is the major way Americans create wealth, right? Well, discrimination in housing is the major reason that black families, up and down the income scale, have a tiny fraction of the family wealth that white families do, even white families with less education and lower incomes. For almost 30 years, 98% of FHA loans were handed out to white borrowers. Not only were black neighborhoods redlined, and not only was the Fair Housing Act selectively enforced, if at all, but it is still today much harder for a black person to get a mortgage or home loan than it is for a white person.
Families are fearful of speaking up about a basic human right that should be afforded to everyone in the world, but definitely in the richest country in the world.
And housing segregation in schools. The primary way that Americans pay for public schools is by paying property taxes. People who live in more valuable homes have better funded local schools, better paid teachers, better school facilities, and more resources. Here's the feedback. The better the schools in a neighborhood, the more those homes in that neighborhood are worth. And the higher the property values of those homes, the more money there is for schools, and so on and so on. And housing segregation in health. Because of urban planning that benefited those richer, whiter neighborhoods, people of color are more likely to live near industrial plants that spew toxic fumes. They're more likely to live far away from grocery stores with fresh food, and in places where the water isn't drinkable. They're more likely to live in neighborhoods with crumbling infrastructure and in homes with toxic paint.
When you're living with rats, roaches, and things like that, you cannot have that kind of stuff with children running around in a building that may be full of lead.
And not coincidentally, people of color have higher incidences of certain cancers, asthma, and heart disease. And housing segregation in policing. Housing segregation means we are having vastly different experiences with crime and vastly different experiences with policing. Because our neighborhoods are so segregated, sometimes racial profiling can be camouflaged as spatial profiling, where living in certain areas can make you more likely to be stopped by the police. And it means that people have a lot of unnecessary contact with the criminal justice system just because of where they live.
The problem in our city, the police and the citizens are fighting. They keep targeting my brothers and sisters who don't really have nothing.
And that heavy, aggressive kind of policing that you see in black neighborhoods in particular makes people feel like they can't trust the police. And when people don't trust the police, crimes go unsolved. And people have to find other ways to keep themselves safe. But of course, it's not just Baltimore, because housing segregation and discrimination fundamentally shape the lives of people in nearly every major American city. It really is in everything. To hear more about how race shapes American life, visit npr.org/codeswitch.
Okay, so we're just gonna get back, there we go. All right, so next, there we go. Thank you. So, I think we wanted to show that because we want folks to understand kind of the history of zoning. Zoning in its intent is laudable. It's a valuable intent to separate harmful uses from where people live, where people work. But in history, it has been used in a very negative way. So this is a quote from a book called The Color of Law. And you can see here, our system of official segregation was not the result of a single law that consigned African Americans to designated neighborhoods. Rather, scores of racially explicit laws, regulations, and government practices to combine to create a nationwide system of urban ghettos surrounded by white suburbs. So zoning is the system of land use regulations that most American cities and towns use. And again, it defines what kind of building can be built on a plot of land. It has a long history. It was adopted for land uses specifically back in Germany in the late 19th century and adopted in the United States in the early 20th century, again, for very good reasons to protect people. But it ended up being used in many ways in negative. So this is a map of St. Louis, similar to the map that you have on your tables of redlining here in Chelsea. Most of the early momentum for zoning actually came from urban reformers and progressives, but the movement for zoning grew as Jim Crow laws were being enacted in the South and border states. And then it kind of grew beyond. So zoning really became a valuable tool for segregationist efforts to legally enforce separation. And as you saw in the video, early zoning laws explicitly forbade African Americans from living in certain districts and only allowed them to live in designated areas. But there was a ruling in 1917 that the major tool of zoning was thereafter the enactment of single-family districts, which you saw again in the video. And they continue to be used to enforce racial segregation through a mechanism that was no longer explicitly racial. So instead, they were creating single-family districts rather than explicitly saying African Americans can't live here. And actually, there was this is a piece from a primer that came out in 1921, the National Advisory Committee on Zoning. Frederick Law Olmsted, who some of you may know, he's a Massachusetts resident and an architect and planner, he said, in any housing developments which are to succeed, racial divisions have to be taken into account. If you try to force the mingling of people who are not ready to mingle and don't want to mingle, a development cannot succeed economically. So there was this pervasive belief underneath zoning that it should perpetuate discrimination and segregation. And zoning exclusions of multifamily housing was also associated from the very beginning with racial segregation. In 1926, the Supreme Court favorably decided that multifamily housing comes very near to being a nuisance. And a lower court judge explained that the blighting of property values and the congesting of population are well known to be associated with colored or certain foreign races. So I think, again, it was finding more and more pervasive ways to get into our zoning codes. And as you saw in the video, districts where African Americans lived were zoned to include industrial uses or were right next to industrial zones. So it has resulted in the disparate racial health outcomes of the 21st century. So African American neighborhoods were often zoned for uses that white neighborhoods never would be zoned for, like manufacturing, hazardous waste sites. And again, this is still felt today because of exposure to toxic air and soil and water. And the value of the homes in these neighborhoods were also negatively affected by the proximity to those industrial sites. So I'm going to pass it over to Caroline to talk about what this has looked like healthy.
Thank you. Hi, good evening. I am Caroline Ellenberg, and I work at Green Roots and coordinate the Anti-Displacement Roundtable. And what I'd like to do now is take you through a whirlwind tour of of some of the land use and policies in Chelsea. Many of you will know things that are not on here, and I would love to hear more stories. This is a slideshow that some interns at Green Group put together last summer. So again, what we're doing is we're leading up to hearing about zoning today, and I just want you to think about how decisions that we make, actions that we take on the land shape the reality that we all live in together. Okay, so with that being said, in this brief whirlwind history, Chelsea was first known as Winnisimmet, and the native people who were here, the Massachusetts tribe, lived there until the land was conquered by the English settlers, and there was displacement. It's the Anti-Displacement Roundtable. And then in the 1900s, Chelsea had an industrial boom, and Chelsea became a very dense city. A lot of immigrants moved here. There were job opportunities. Many houses were built, especially along the waterfront where the industry was. How many people here live in a triple-decker in one of the houses that has 3 floors on it? Right? Okay, that is the typical Chelsea, Massachusetts, but the workers' housing. So next slide, please. So you guys saw this on your table, some of you, and this is Chelsea's map of redlining. Interesting to note that there is no green on this map, right? So 55% of Chelsea was called definite, there's no best, no still desirable. 50% of Chelsea, the yellow, 55% was definitely declining, and 45%, the red, was considered hazardous. Okay, this is our entire city, not just some neighborhoods of it. So it's interesting just to understand history. This was due to things like the infiltration of Jewish families and foreign-born families. It meant that Chelsea residents could not access government loans, and this kept them from becoming homeowners. So this is our local history. Quickly, other key moments in the history of land use in Chelsea. The Tobin Bridge. Everyone goes over the Tobin Bridge. Hundreds of households were displaced when the Tobin Bridge cut right through the middle of Chelsea. Many of your families, many of you, there are people here, I'm sure, who can remember that, or who have parents or uncles or aunts who were here when the Tobin Bridge went through. Next slide, please. Fires. Chelsea's landscape has been defined by a history of fires that wiped out big areas, and these fires had to do with the industry. So everything is connected together. 1908, over 1,500 homes were lost. 1973, 1,000 people were displaced. 300 homes were lost. And again, many people in this room have families who have experienced this. A few other landmarks. 1991, Chelsea went into receivership. It was placed under control of the state due to bankruptcy and corruption. Between 1987 and 1993, Chelsea's housing prices fell by 57%. So we have an up and a down, and we have a turmoil, the history of turmoil. 2008, next slide, is the housing crisis, where Chelsea was one of Massachusetts' hardest hit cities in the foreclosure crisis. More than 330 homes were foreclosed. 1 in 30 of the city's households. That's a lot of people, especially since many of those households had renters as well, so even more people were impacted. One of the legacies of communities that were redlined, like Chelsea, is that there often is a rent gap. There's a difference between the potential value of a property and what people were paying, and that makes it very attractive to professionals, to developers, and so rents and housing values have been going up, and we've all experienced that. And the next one, everybody here knows this one, which is the pandemic. So we all know Chelsea was hit really hard. One of the things to realize, because of rising housing costs, many people were living, many families in a house or in an apartment, close together, right? The impact on public health was significant. And afterwards, also the widespread loss of income and people getting sick. Many people are facing eviction. This is our continued legacy. We are living the history of Chelsea now. So housing today in Chelsea. 74% of households in Chelsea are renters. Between 2011 and 2016, 38% increase in the average Chelsea rent. 54% of Chelsea renters are cost burdened. That means that they pay more than 30% of their income in rent. As 47% of Massachusetts renters. 54% of properties in Chelsea have had a housing code violation, and of those, 85% of those were classified as high risk. So there's a snippet of housing now. Now the impacts of redlining, zoning, and land use policies go beyond housing. You saw that picture of the factory at the end of the last slide. We all know Chelsea is highly industrial. So living in redlined areas has been linked to many present-day health impacts, including severe asthma, birth outcomes, food environments, and urban heat. These are all issues that we grapple with here in Chelsea. So here again are the maps, and I guess I didn't actually see this map on the tables. Did anyone get to see this map here? So this map is, John's going to tell us more about, but this is our current zoning map. And this is the redlining map. And you all looked at other maps at the beginning. So what I'd like you to do is take a minute. Do we have time to do it at tables, or should we do it at the full group? Yeah. So now, with your table, I'd like you to look again at these maps and notice, now that you know more about what redlining means, what the yellow means, what do you notice now? What questions do you have about zoning, land use, the history in Chelsea, and how have you experienced any of this personally? Please write it down, because we want to hear this. We're not at your tables with you, but we really want to hear your story. What is your relationship with some of what you've seen here? Any questions about what I'm asking you to do now? So talk with your neighbors, pick up a pencil, look at the map, look at this map too, and in a few minutes, John from the planning from the city is going to talk about zoning now in Chelsea. Thank you. Okay. Please wrap up what you're writing, what you're thinking, what you're saying. And I would love to hear just a couple. We have a lot of people here and we don't have a lot of time for a full group thing, but can we actually zoom this back out to the two maps? Thanks. So you started off the evening looking at these maps, and then saw a video, learned a little bit about zoning, a little bit about the history of Chelsea. What do you notice? Anyone want to share something key that they notice now? Or something just interesting? What do you notice now about these maps? Or the maps on your table?
El cambio de colores.
The change of colors. Tell me, what, Vicente? Say more about, what do you notice about the change of colors?
Mire que hay colores nuevos.
Okay, oh, so they're new colors. Okay, fair enough, right? And these, just to be clear too, that these are not the same map. What this is the redlining, right? This is when the federal government said that it's hazardous to make loans here. This area is definitely declining. Now what this is our zoning map today. So they mean very different things. This is residence 3, three unit or residences. This is R2. This is R1. So just looking at that, do you see similarities between R2, R3, and R1 when you look at the colors there? Maybe some correlation. Other things that anyone noticed or wanted to share? Anything about how you have experienced any of this or any questions that you have? Yeah, Robert. Industry does not let go of territory. The industrial areas are the same. Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah.
The red zones are still marked pretty clearly on the new map.
The red zones are still marked pretty clearly on the new map. Okay, thank you. Other observations, questions, comments? Just, yeah. Yeah. So, sorry, you said our... Okay, so yeah, so she says the difference, R1, R2, R1, R2, and R3 means you can develop it differently. And so we're going to hear more about that. Okay, was anyone here, does anyone have any memory of any of the fires or Tobin Bridge coming through in Chelsea? We have a younger crowd tonight. John, yeah. Receivership, okay, yeah, how about receivership, right? Okay. Pandemic? Everybody? Okay. Well, thank you all very much. And I want to just emphasize, this is the very beginning of a 4-part series. So we really hope that you're going to come back and participate in these conversations as we shape, right? The point that I want to make is that the land use decisions of the past shape now. So the land use decisions we make now shape our future. So this is your job, our job as residents of Chelsea, to be involved in making the decisions to shape the Chelsea that we want to see in the future. Thank you.
Hello? Hello, my name is John Priest. I'm the Director of Permitting and Land Use Planning for the city. I staff the Planning Board, the Zoning Board, the Historical Commission, and the Conservation Commission. I'm going to give you a brief rundown of what zoning is in Chelsea today. These are the, as you saw previously, these are the zoning districts. Not much different, well, some similarities between the redlining and the house today. You saw the wedges that are the same shape. The purple areas are the industrial areas. The green areas are the shopping centers. The yellow is the R1, the orange is the R2. This reddish here is R3. This is the neighborhood business district. This is the downtown business district. This is the soldiers' home. I'm sorry, the Naval Hospital area. These are what are called overlay districts. Overlay district is a district that can cover underlying districts, but they offer more uses or more restrictions. For example, smart growth districts. They overlay the R2 district, but they allow for more development in those districts. If you own property in there, you can either develop under the R2, or you can develop under the, with allow more density in the overlay. Simple definition that you give on an overlay district. Beyond zoning, there are other laws and regulations that regulate land uses. For example, in Chelsea, there is what's called the designated port area. It's a state regulation that limits uses in this area to water-related industrial uses. You can't put residential there, you can't put open space there. You can only do industry that needs to be on a waterfront. It's not a local regulation, it's a state regulation. The city does not enforce this, the state. Each zoning ordinance starts with the purpose, the intent of what the zoning does. And this list of 11 of them. These 11 purposes come straight from the state regulation that tells you, that allows you to do zoning. But you'll note that some of these are really key to what we're talking about tonight. Provide adequate height of air, avoid overcrowding of land, encourage housing for persons of all income levels, provide for adequate transportation and water and sewers and open space and schools, and conserve the value of land and buildings. The purpose, the intent of what the zoning is supposed to be. Thank you. Thank you. When you open your zoning book, you'll see a table here that can tell you what uses you can do and where you can do it. Some of the key uses here, some of the key principles are these are the different types of uses. For example, a kennel, a hotel, or a convenience store. And when you look at the different districts, R1, R2, all the way out to maybe hospital commercial, if you see an N, it's not permitted. If you see a special, an SP, it means you've got to get a special permit for that. I'll explain what that is later. If you see a Y, you can do it by right. You don't need to go to the zoning board for a permit. So for example, a bakery, delicatessen, candy, fish store, not permitted in any of the residential districts, permitted by right in all the business districts, but needs a special permit in some of the others.
What's the difference between each R?
Each R?
Yeah, what's the difference between
R1, it depends on what level of development you can do in those districts. R1, 1,500 square feet, and you can do 1 and 2 families. R2, minimum of 5,000 square feet, you can do 1, 2, and 3. A minimum of 10,500 square feet, you can do apartment buildings. R3, similar. Minimum 5,000 square feet and just a level of density that you put in. Zoning board. The zoning board of appeals is in Bedford, in Chelsea is the special permit granting authority. They are the ones who, when you come for a permit for the zoning, zoning, they're the ones that issue the permit. So it's a 5-member board with 1 alternate. And 4 members are here. I'm the staff. I'll let the left in my office serves as the secretary. Planning board has different responsibilities. In the case of a special permit, they provide a recommendation to the zoning board of appeals. They also want to conduct what's called major site plan review, and I'll go into that in a minute. They conduct public hearings and reviews, and they also are responsible for approving the division of lots. 9-member board. I am the staff of this board. So, you want to do zoning, this is the process that you do. You go to the building department, special services department. You apply for a building permit. They look at your building permit, and they review it to determine if it complies with zoning. If it complies with zoning, they can issue the permit. If not, they send it to the zoning board for whatever permit you need, special permit, variance, or site plan review. We have an application form. We provide 21 copies of that application form to the city clerk's office. City clerk stamps it in, so there's a date and time. That's important because the zoning board and the city board have a certain amount of time to take the work on it. Once they receive the application sent out to my office, we set up the hearings with the zoning board. Variance, they go to the zoning board. The site plan or special permits, the planning board gets involved as well. And we'll set up those hearings. Special permit, site plan, the planning board will make their recommendation, they'll vote. Send out to the zoning board. The zoning board will review all that and they'll make their final vote. After they make the final vote, they have to write up a legal decision. Legalese, like 10 pages long. That gets filed with the city clerk's office. Once it's filed with the city clerk's office, there's a 20-day appeal period, meaning that others or other parties in interest can appeal it or chose not to. Once that 20-day appeal period is up, the building department can issue a building permit. They goes forward. There's other departments involved that just not mine. We work with the community development department, the public works department, the fire department, and police department, and others. We all work together during this process to review and approve. When the board is reviewing special permits and variances, they have a set of criteria that they're supposed to be looking at that they have to address. For special permits, it's needs criteria. There has to be some social, economic, or community needs. If it's a business, is it providing local jobs? Is it providing local income? Is it providing taxes? Traffic flow and safety, are they providing off-street parking? Are they doing it in a safe way? Are they mitigating any impact? Adequate utilities and public services, is there adequate water, is there adequate sewage? In Chelsea, that's generally not, it's generally okay, they have decent utilities, so that's generally not an issue. Neighborhood character, does it fit in with the neighborhood? Is it a use that fits in there? Is it built in such a way that it's built consistent with the neighborhood? Impacts on the natural environment, is it causing problems with runoff? Is it causing problems with trash or too much impervious surface? Fiscal impact on the city, is it going to provide taxes? Is it going to cost more to service that new use than we're getting it back in taxes? That's something they take into consideration. In the special permit, they don't have to meet all of them, but they should be meeting most of them. Variance is different. It's 4 conditions, and they have to meet all 4. One, if there's something peculiar to the soil, or to the shape of the lot, or the topography of the lot that makes that variance necessary. 2, if the city enforces that zoning literally, it's going to be a hardship, either financial or otherwise. 3, the board can grant this without really impacting negatively on the neighborhood. And the last one, the board can grant it without really derogating from the intent of the zone, those 11 purposes that we showed you earlier. Questions? This is in the zoning. It was included in the zoning when the zoning was written. They set the criteria for determining. More than likely, if you look at special permit criteria in other communities, they're going to be set.
Would climate change and sea rise be part of the variance?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear.
Looking at the floodplains, climate change and sea rise, would that also be part of the variance?
Yes. she's asking if the floodplain sea level rise would take into it. Yes, it does. The city action, zoning ordinance actually includes a floodplain district in there. Yeah, it's built in there, they have to build those certain standards as well.
Discúlpeme, yo miro de que esta es la manera de que se va a construir lo que ya está aprobado.
Is this when the construction has already been approved, that you take this in consideration?
This is the criteria used to decide whether you want to grant that permit or not. So it's before the permit's granted.
O sea que todos los permisos que han dado, los edificios, ellos construyen su propio parqueo o es mentira. Porque es mentira, yo al frente de mí, de aquí, de la Cherry, están construyendo un edificio que no tiene ni acera. O sea, se agarró toda hasta la acera y no miró el parqueo.
So in regards to the parking, do they have to provide parking? Because I've noticed that there's a huge building that's being built in front of my house, and they basically took up all the sidewalk, and they don't have any parking allowed for that building.
There is a standard
Frente a la Cherry.
new development has to provide off-street parking. However, they can ask for relief from that. If they do get their relief, effective as of January of 2020, if they get that relief, the tenants cannot get sticker parking, resident sticker parking.
Una de las mentiras más grandes.
It depends. Okay, so the question was, how does, if a building is granted relief for parking, how does it benefit the rest of the community? Generally, they have to provide some reasoning for not providing all the parking. For example, especially if it's all affordable, it's generally you're going to have fewer cars for an all affordable development. So it makes sense that you would allow for some relief for that. So there has to be something mitigating the need for that off-street parking. You have to meet the same criteria. In fact, when you go to the meeting, they will ask you each of these questions, and they will determine whether you meet them or not. If you don't meet them, they're not going to answer it. The question is, how do these criteria work for a local small homeowner or developer as opposed to the larger one? They're the same. How can you participate? All the information that the developers give us is public information. You have a right to look at it. It's on file with the city clerk's office. You have a right to go and ask them to review it. Come to my office, I'll let you look at the copy I have. It's all public information. You can attend these public meetings. Public meetings, you have a right to attend and to listen. So some of them are called public hearings, in which case you have a right to attend and speak about the development that's there. And you can either do that in person or you can submit written comments. Ask questions. You can meet with me, talk to me. I'll meet with anybody who wants to learn about the development that's going on. Or you can attend the meetings and ask the developers and ask the boards questions. You can also become a member of the board. And the process is you submit a letter of interest and a resume to the city manager. The city manager will review it, and he will send it to the city council for confirmation. Right now, there are no openings on the zoning board. Zoning board openings rarely grow, and there's usually long-term members on there. Planning board may have one opening attempt to turn it. This is the process of zoning changes. Okay, the zoning can be amended from time to time. The process is that you submit a zoning amendment, and actually it can be a planning board, zoning board, council, city manager, any 10 residents or a property owner of land to be affected by the zoning change can submit a zoning change to the city council for consideration. Once you do that, the city council will review it. They will send it to the planning board. The planning board will hold a public hearing on it. You are entitled to attend that meeting and make comments. The planning board will then make a recommendation on that zoning amendment to the city council. The city council will hold a public hearing, and again, you can speak on it there. Once they hold that public hearing, they then vote on it. Assuming that it passes, it gets published in the newspaper and it becomes law. That's my contact. I'm available to talk to anybody about it. My email. Thank you.
Thanks, John. So we're coming close to the end of the session. We really want to get everyone out of here at 8 o'clock. So we want to spend just a few minutes at your tables. Now that you've seen the second presentation on zoning, we want you to make some connections between the two presentations. Take just a few minutes to talk amongst yourselves and take some notes on that. And also make a note of any questions that you have, because as we mentioned, this is the first of 4 sessions. So we're going to hope to be able to answer those questions as we move forward. So just a few minutes at your table, and then Oriana is going to wrap us up. All right? Okay, we're going to wrap up. So a couple things before our next session. So one is we're asking you to do something between now and the next session, which is April 13th. So that's about 2 weeks. This is a way for us to gather information for any updates to the zoning code, and also for a conversation starter at the next meeting. So if you can take one picture that represents what you learned today in a photo of zoning results that you like in Chelsea, and then one photo of zoning results that you don't like in Chelsea. And you can either print it and bring it, or you can text each picture to these phone numbers. So here's an example. These are mine. I like Bellingham Hill because it has a corner store mixed with housing, and you can't really see, but there's a park there. So I would not want zoning to take away the ability for the corner store and the housing and the park to exist together. Often, some places it's not allowed. So when I dislike, this is the waterfront. You can't really see the waterfront because it's covered up by industrial and warehouses and the salt pile. And I would like if that was a public access park. So again, so text the photo you like to 617. You can all write this down. 470-3471. And the photo you don't like to 401-753-2081. You want me to repeat those numbers? No? Alright, I'll just leave it up. You can take a picture if you would like. So the final, next slide. Thank you all for coming so much. I know this was 2 hours out of your night and we ran out of food. Did not expect so many people here, but we're glad that you came.